Hey everyone, welcome back to the Peak Sports Psychiatry Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at 43 Degrees Sports, a company that's actually revolutionizing post-game recovery. If you've ever thrown your gear into a bag and forgotten about it, you know the smell I'm talking about. 43 Degrees Sports created a temperature-controlled hockey bag that kills up to 96% of harmful bacteria. No chemicals, no noise, no hassle. It's clean gear ready to perform. Check them out at 43degreesports.com and see why hockey's dirtiest secret just met its match. Welcome back to the Peak Sports Psychiatry Podcast. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Timothy Fong, a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA Jane and Terry Simmel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Dr. Fong is one of the country's leading experts in addiction psychiatry and behavioral addictions, particularly gambling disorder. He's the co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program, director of the UCLA Addiction Psychiatry Fellowship, and part of the faculty leadership of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative. And for our audience in sports, Dr. Fong also has a pretty fun role serving as the team psychiatrist for the Los Angeles Lakers, giving him a front row seat to how these issues intersect with elite performance, pressures, and modern sports culture. Tim, welcome to the show. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Welcome,
Thank you
Tim.
for having me.
Well, Tim, before we jump in, let's start with a simple question, if that's okay. So how did you find your way into addiction psychiatry? You're the first psychiatrist, I think, besides Mark and I, that we've had on this podcast. So we're really excited to have you here as one of our brethren. How did you get into addiction psychiatry, gambling disorder specifically? That's an area that sometimes is still a little bit misunderstood. How did you get into that?
Well, very much so. And thanks for asking. So it goes all the way back. I'm technically a Generation X physician. So I went to medical school in the 90s. Mid-90s was the first time people ushered the word addiction is a brain disease. 1995. And that made a huge impression on me as a medical student. I went to the Betty Ford Center to learn about addiction. I was fascinated by addiction in the mid-90s. I came to UCLA in 1998. And one of the very first things I saw in residency in 1998 were a bunch of casinos. And I was really wondering, well, what's the deal with the gambling and the casino? And is that an addiction? Because when you don't take any drugs into your body, how could it be a brain disease if the drugs aren't changing your brain? So I always had an interest in gambling. So right around the turn of the century, amazing to think about that in the year 2000, is really when I decided to pursue an academic career studying gambling behavior. I really saw it as the forefront of the internet gambling. Sports betting was potentially in its infancy, but I really thought of it as a public health issue, even in 2000. The idea that gambling was going to expand, and we as psychiatrists have to understand what is its impact on the body, brain, mind, spirit, and financial portfolios of everybody. So with that, I did the addiction fellowship at UCLA 2002. And a couple years later, 2005, I had the opportunity to start our UCLA Gambling Studies Program, along with my friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Richard Rosenthal, who put the criteria for gambling addiction at that time called pathological gambling into the DSM-4. And we started that in 2005. And now it's been 20 years. So 20 years of studying gambling trends, studying gambling behaviors, studying gambling addiction, now formerly known as gambling disorder. And even just 5 years ago, I never would have predicted the change in the landscape of sports betting and wagering and words like parlay and prediction markets and poly market, things that you and I never would have known about 5 years ago. It's a long-winded way of saying, and particularly for any medical students out there, that you kind of followed what you're passionate about. I was passionate about understanding about the brain, about addiction, and about gambling just as an activity, and wondering that basic question, what's going on in the brain and in the minds of people with a gambling disorder? What makes them unique? I don't like to use the word damaged. What makes them different, say, than from someone else who can gamble a little bit but never incur the harm that comes with addiction?
Wow. Okay, so let me kind of back up a little bit. So you're working with the dude who put the criteria in the DSM-4. That's amazing. You've been working at this now for over 20 years.
Yes.
So you have seen everything. You've seen the lexicon change, and now we're using the phrasing gambling disorder, which I think is a great way to kind of aptly put it. But in America, roughly 1 to 2% of the population have gambling disorder, which can really surprise a lot of people. So can you put that into context for our listeners?
Oh, yeah. So, first of all, you think about gambling disorder. Again, we're talking about a series of behavior characterized by continued gambling despite harmful consequences. Just like alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, cannabis, it's an unhealthy relationship that results in harm. And gambling disorder is a biological, psychological, social condition. And oftentimes people are like, do I have it or do I not have it? Well, people go in and out of episodes of gambling disorder and periods where they don't gamble and periods when they do. But you think about what percentage of Americans have an alcohol use disorder? It's roughly like 12, 13%. Cannabis, around 4%. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major mental illnesses that we all learn about in medical school, about 1 to 2%. Depression's around 15%. Hypertension, 25, 30%. So when people say, how many Americans have gambling addiction? Invariably, when I say to medical students, they think it's incredibly rare, like 1 in a million. And it's not. That means 1 out of 100 people just walking around the streets of wherever you are in America at that given time in their lives are struggling with a relationship with gambling that's creating harm. What kind of harm? Physical harm, psychological harm, social harm, financial harm, spiritual harm. That's the kind of harm that we're talking about. So to put it in context with folks, we're saying, oh my God, why aren't we talking about a gambling crisis like we are with opioids? Well, we're starting to. But the idea is that there are a lot more folks out there with gambling disorder than they realize. The thing is that most people with a gambling addiction or gambling disorder, they don't even know they got the problem. They say, no, I don't have a gambling addiction. I have a money problem, or I have a luck problem, or I have a spouse or partner that doesn't understand my system. I see all the time, oh, I have a problem because the sports are rigged. My system would have worked normally, except the referee screwed up, or the NBA doesn't want me to win money. So there are a lot of easy ways to explain away the harm caused by gambling losses. That's why I'm surprised where a lot of folks come into my office and they say, I don't have a gambling problem. I have a money problem. And then we go through the criteria and say, no, your money problems are caused by your gambling disorder.
Yeah, the insight there, it's almost like, is it egosyntonic or dystonic? Do they understand? Do they think it's a problem? And it's usually somebody else who sees the problem and the ripple effect into their life, and those that are affected, they get them to come in. And I would challenge, I don't know the epidemiology as well as what you just listed off, but is it 1 to 2%, or some states that have had increased legalized gambling? Are we seeing not 1 in 100, but 1 in 20, people that,
Yeah.
that might have pathological or gambling? What do you say to
Yeah.
that, Tim?
So I'm from Illinois. I grew up in Chicago. I'm a Midwest guy. You're in St. Louis, in
Yep.
Missouri, and Mark's in Colorado. So, as an example, like Oklahoma did a recent statewide survey that showed 6% of Oklahomans struggle with gambling disorder. In Illinois, where I'm from, that number is 4%. And you say, well, why are these numbers going up? Is it because we're recognizing more? Are we screening more? Are we diagnosing things earlier, just like autism? A little bit. But we also have just more gambling. And you introduce more gambling opportunities 24/7 on the phone, casinos, apps, strip malls. Where I'm from in Illinois, when I grew up, there were no casinos. Now, I was just back there for the holidays, 2025. You can drive along the freeway, along surface streets, and you can literally gamble in a gas station with a slot machine. And so, of course, gambling in 2026 is much, much more available and accessible. And as we know, as we learn from the opioid world, when you increase opioid supply, you create more problems. And that's exactly what we see. Increased access to gambling, increased access to money online, which is another huge part of gambling disorder. Then, unfortunately, you do see some vulnerable folks who never would have gone to do this before are now able to do it from the comforts of their bedrooms or bathrooms or cars, and unfortunately develop problems in a short stretch of time.
It's wild, and it's on your device 24/7. And we will tie this to sports psychiatry. This is a sports psychiatry podcast still. We will get into that, and there is a definite connection. But I'm thinking about that accessibility and how, with my own kids, teenagers, seeing this being normalized, right? Whereas you're not going to see as much cigarette commercials or, other things, but we are seeing ads in Missouri now this year for all sorts of opportunities and promotions to get on here. And this thing buzzes at you and sends notifications. It's not just like an alcoholic with access to alcohol. It's like you're shaking every time you don't make a bet. So I see it, I think this is just the start of an increase in a whole generation of gamblers. I don't know if you see it that way. And then if we can also talk about the young athletes out there who already identify with sports, and so they're maybe more drawn to betting on sports. What would you say to that?
Yeah, here's the thing. So the world of 2026 is so different than when I grew up in the 80s and so different than when you grew up in the 90s and 2000s. Here's what we know. We know that when you normalize an activity, what do? You decrease perception of harm. And gambling has no longer viewed as harmful because why? The media talks about it, there are ads, but you see forces that never would have been combined are combining now, right? So sports leagues, casino operators, television networks, traditional media, celebrities, right? And when you put them all together, of course, anyone who doesn't know anything about gambling is like, oh, wow, everybody's doing it. Everyone's making money. Everyone's dancing and celebrating and wearing fancy suits and talking about this, talking about that. Well, how can I not get into it? So what we learned from cannabis world, right, is when you decrease perception of harm, you increase initiation, you increase likelihood of using at a younger age, you increase likelihood of persisting and continuing and doing that activity. That's where some folks are concerned about. I'm certainly concerned about it. But you go back to the bottom line. Gambling is a regulated adult activity. 18 and up in most states, 21 and up in most. And yet, when you normalize it, it makes it seem like it's fine for a 14, 15, 16-year-old to do it. I had a friend from med school yesterday. He texted me, hey, my son's friend is 14 and he's doing a YouTube channel about his gambling picks. Should his parents be concerned? So the kid isn't gambling at all. The kid is making a YouTube video about what teams he likes to cover the spread and things like that. So it's completely normalized, but it's also under the cover of him talking about sports and betting. So that's number one. Number two, so then when you have athletes of any age from 0 up to 80 entering into the athletic space in this setting, you can see what a complex and difficult world it is. When you have gambling as part of it, when you as an athlete are interested in gambling or not, or are affected by all sorts of things. And we'll get into that in a second. But that's some of the observations that I see. And I think for us as adults who are regulating the gambling activity, we really have to look hard at that messaging. Is this the right message we want to be sending to the world about a potentially addictive behavior? The vast majority of people who gamble do not incur long-lasting harm, just like the vast majority of people who smoke cannabis don't. But we don't advertise cannabis at all on any sort of public airways, do we? Because it's Schedule 1 and a lot of basic laws and let through by, imagine walking into any, Colorado right there. Imagine going into the ball arena and having cannabis everywhere inside the arena, given to you as you entered into the arena, dispense inside. And that that wouldn't happen. The state legislator wouldn't do that.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you go in a ball arena now, there'll be a QR code for, $100 of free bets if you sign up for whatever. And, by the end of the game, you see a bunch of people around you have all kind of taken a screenshot, and then they're downloading the app and they're like really pissed off about a third period goal that might have been scored or not, that they missed the over under. You nailed so many different things there as far as like how just normalized it's been in the culture. I can see Jamie Foxx standing in front of the big lion, those ads used to, those like a few years ago, just were all over the place. And I thought it back in the day when I'd go to Vegas or something and you go to the airport after leaving Vegas that you still could bet. I thought that was like unique. Now, obviously, you got a casino in your phone and you get notifications on whatever. If you have BetMGM or the new one that's really annoying to me is Kalshi. I don't know what that says about myself as far as seeing ads like that, just even on Instagram, but it's everywhere. So you can bet on anything, not just even sports. So I guess my question to you is, since roughly 2018, we've seen an explosion in legalized sports betting and, with the casino being in the phone. Why do you think that shift happened?
So it's very simple. So in 2018, the Supreme Court said, hey, we are not going to ban sports betting on a national level, and we're going to allow each state to basically decide whether they want to allow sports betting in that state. It was a lawsuit brought on by New Jersey, by Governor Christie, who basically saw the writing on the wall saying, hey, we're already losing a lot of revenue to the unregulated gambling space on sports betting. I think what people forget is that sports betting exploded in part by fantasy sports, same day fantasy, but really by the speed of the internet and by online commerce. So once that technology and those software became to the point where you can now have all these bets in real time at rapid speed and trade money and do whatever, that's really when companies started to pop up, illegal, unregulated websites first, but then states saying, hey, this doesn't make sense for us to lose money to an unregulated site. We might as well regulate it ourselves. And if the feds aren't going to do it from a national perspective, let the states allow it. So that really opened the door in 2018, just 7 years ago. So in 7 years, we've gone from 2 states having legalized sports betting to now over 40 plus. But we really have every single state in America has online sports betting available to every citizen in America. It's just not legal or unregulated. So again, I'm in California where they've declared many of these fantasy sport companies as unregulated, unlawful, but not yet we're going to shut them down. So they quasi exist. They're certainly available. And there's literally dozens, if not hundreds, of unregulated, quote, illegal gambling websites where you can get the exact same bets that you would get on any regulated app like FanDuel or DraftKings. So, like, look, we have the football playoffs tonight, right? And I can go on any of these illegal websites and get any single player prop, parlay teaser, whatever I want, just because the internet's grown that quickly. So that's, I think, why it spread so much. And when you combine now the power of AI into this data speed, that's why we're fighting against technology that's growing so rapidly. So really, the three of us could actually create our own sports book relatively quickly if we had any knowledge of computer science and things like that. So put that all together, combined with just the demand from the public. So it's kind of this positive feedback loop where the public is saying, this is great, we want more. People see a market, more apps come out, more opportunities, people invent new bets, invent new opportunities, and it just feeds the cycle over and over and over. So I think that's certainly part of it. And again, look, people have always wanted to bet on sports, right? Ever since the first ball was ever thrown, or even in the hunter-gatherers days when they would bet on bones and where they would land. This is part of the human condition of gambling and wagering and betting on outcomes of uncertain event. That's part of our DNA. And I think that's where what's changed is the environment that we live in has changed so fast in literally just 7 years. And instead of, oftentimes I get a lot of people shocking, oh my God, it's everywhere, it's everywhere. What do we do? What do we do? And I say, you know what? Educate yourself. Realize that the world that we live in is very different than 8, 9 years ago. And then pay attention to how that world makes you think, feel, and what you do. And I think that's the starting point rather than try and look away or try and shut these things down, but really recognize, hey, these things are out there. You might as well understand what they are and understand what they aren't. So one of the key messages, I'll get it out super early, that gambling or sports gambling is not a job. It is not a way to make guaranteed money. One of the curious things I saw this last week was a prediction market company saying, hey, this is a side gig. Make a little bit extra money in your jammies. And I really thought that was really untrue. It was really false advertising. It was suggesting that there was a guaranteed income. Like if I drive for DoorDash or Uber, I guarantee we'll make money. But the prediction market was saying, oh, if you log on and do and trade here, you will guaranteed make money. And I thought that was so disingenuous. And there's no way a legal gambling company would ever get that ad approved because it's unequivocally false.
Yeah, that's unbelievable that they're putting that out there. I like the holistic way you look at this. It's a biopsychosocial disorder, just like a lot of things we treat. The speed of the environment, the speed at which you can gamble is just unbelievable and will only get faster. And the amount that you can gamble on, going from, there's that fine line or that area where it goes from a recreation to a disorder. And now I think figuring out when that tips over into a disorder and the harm that it's causing can be maybe harder to track in this environment. And I would also say, maybe you would agree with this, that sometimes people get in trouble for gambling when they don't have a disorder. So we're thinking about younger athletes, and all three of us have worked with different universities where this is a problem. I don't know that there's enough policy and regulation at the university level. So can you talk a little bit about what, especially for young athletes, where does that cross the line into a disorder? And do you see clients or patients that, have a gambling problem, but not really an addiction? It's causing harm for them.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And, I give credit to the NCAA. We just recorded a spotlight series on this. So that's coming out soon. But
Awesome.
the way I think about it now is gambling as part of the athletic experience is and should be part of the athletic training experience. It's like sleep hygiene, it's like nutrition, it's like recovery. It's
Hmm.
like just understanding how to do well. I really think of gambling affecting athletes in three ways. One, it could create a gambling addiction. Two, athletes have a duty to maintain the highest level of integrity in the sports and not be influenced by gambling to change the sports integrity. And third, athletes are oftentimes a victim of abuse and targeted by someone else's gambling. So the online abuse, the you lost me money, how dare you, I'm going to come after you, things like that. So I think for any athlete, even entering the athletic space, even in, can you believe this, in junior high, because you can bet on the Little League World Series, right? So the idea that as soon as you can start talking to an athlete about what does it mean to be an athlete, that this should come into their understanding. So you're absolutely right. So you don't have to have a gambling disorder to have and lose an athletic career from gambling. I worked with an NFL player one time who he didn't have a problem at all. And he had downloaded an app. He did not know that the app he downloaded could be geolocated to where he was. He happened to be inside a, training facility for the league. That alerted it went from the gambling operator to the league office to say, hey, this account should not be opened inside the league's premise. Ding, 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 ding. Therefore, he's violating the gambling policy. Next thing you know, he's suspended for a year. He loses a couple $1 million. And that's pretty dramatic. I mean, imagine if you were in the hospital and you opened up a gambling app, you didn't know, next thing you know, you were suspended from the hospital for a year. But that's one of the problems, I think, is that the gambling policies are not well mapped out, so athletes aren't always sure. So one of the things I advocate for colleges is create a gambling policy in writing like you have for alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. And so that athletes know what's allowed and what's not. And we see all sorts of perplexing stories that come up and you're not sure what's true or what's not. Like I had an athlete who he was just gambling for a friend who lived in a state where the apps were not allowed. So he thought, oh, I'm just doing my friend a favor because I live in a state where it is allowed. He's just telling me what to bet on. And I'm just betting on these bets for him. I don't care. He was using his name and his account, and he had no idea that, again, that his career potentially would be at risk or jeopardy. So really, that's how I think about for athletes, making sure they themselves do not develop a gambling addiction, making sure that they themselves maintain the highest level of integrity of the sport for themselves, so they're not influenced, and then of course not being handling, when they become victims of abuse by online bettors.
So I'm just going to get this out there right now as a PSA. This episode is not brought to you by Peak Sportsbook.
We
Anyway,
have that problem.
I don't think so.
No.
I will say, so you talked about prop bets, and where now individual athletes can get bet on related to their performance. And we're seeing, you talked about the harassment, so that, athletes are getting harassed because they missed a shot or dropped a pass or whatever. How concerning is that specific trend? Is there any way that we can protect our athletes?
So this is where I think us as a field in sports psychiatry need to come up with some basic guidelines and best practices, right? Because
Okay.
imagine, someone saying, Dr. Allen, I'm going to bet on whether Dr. Allen writes 3 or more prescriptions for Ativan today. And if he doesn't, I'm going to yell at him.
I'll take
I
the
mean,
under, but yeah.
right?
Okay.
Years our field has always been concerned about, being, harassed or targeted by, clients or family members unhappy with our work, right? So how did we learn to protect ourselves? Well, we learned to stay vigilant, pay close attention to warning signs, practice a lot of humility, but talk to people when things cross the line. So again, for the audience that's not familiar, the topics in question are one of the most popular bets out there are just basically player prop bets, singular bets on a single player's performance in that game. And I had a player who described this to me, and she was a women's basketball player. She's like, it doesn't matter whether I have the game of my life or I have the worst game possible. I'm going to make a lot of money for some people, and I'm going to lose a lot of money for others. And she's like, that's so frustrating because I'm no longer viewed as a person. I'm viewed as a commodity. I'm viewed as a means to an end. And people are not even viewing me as fans of the game. They're just fans of my performance. And she really was so thoughtful. And I wish she would come out publicly and talk about it. She's like, and it really sucks. I don't mind the criticism about blowing a layup. She's like, I just hate it when they dehumanize me and not talk to me as if I was a person. So I said to her, well, so what helps? I said, you can't ignore it. She's like, no, I don't look at comments. And she's like, I basically recognize that this is the world we live in. So she has a very mature view on this sort of thing. But she also said, I also talk about whenever they cross the line and threaten me, I tell authorities, I tell somebody. And I think that's probably the biggest thing when it comes to online abuse. If someone threatens your person, your family, your place of work, that is breaking the law and authorities need to be notified. Unfortunately, a lot of athletes are like, you know what? I'll take matters in my own hand. Or you know what? They're not serious. So all this goes back to the very beginning where if you're starting in your journey of an athlete, realizing these are things you're going to have to contend with that a lot of other professionals do not. However, every professional, look at teachers, they have to contend with potential school shootings every day, right? So it's just part of, I think, of the vigilance of self-care and safety that unfortunately evolved in our country right now. But player prop bets are so interesting because one thought is like, even if you got rid of them and you don't allow them on legal gambling sites, well, that solved the problem. And I don't think it will because you can still always get these bets on illegal, unregulated sites. So again, prohibition is not going to work. Removal of these things aren't going to work. Instead, it's got to be focused for an athlete and really working with athletes saying, you know what? We need to have an honest discussion about the gambling world, how it impacts you, how it may impact you, and what your thoughts are. So now we're getting in the lane where it's not just part of performance, sports performance, but it's also part of just maintenance and ultimately, part of what we do in psychiatry. And a lot of the athletes that I work with don't come to see me for gambling addiction. It's for other stuff like ADHD, depression, cannabis use, injury, dealing with injury, resilience, burnout, same stuff that you all see. I always weave in a little bit in gambling. I say, you know what? We have a few more minutes. I want to talk to you about something that's super important to me. It may not be important to you, but I know it affects your world. And that's, of course, gambling behavior. Just give me a few minutes of what you think, what you see around those three categories I talked about: addiction, integrity, and abuse. And that opens up conversations. And in fact, with this women's basketball player, she brought all this up only after I asked. So she was carrying a lot of this stuff, but she didn't know to talk about it with mental health. So this is why for us as sports psychiatrists, I think we need to start embedding that as part of our screening tool, our social history, our history gathering, and recognizing. And again, for you two, do you ask about gambling and intakes? Is that like a standard question at this point?
Yeah, for me, not enough. Mark, how about you?
On my intake form for athletes that would come to see me that does ask about gambling. That being said, I know after this conversation, I'm going to amplify that question. So thanks for talking with us about this.
Yeah, and we're uniquely positioned, I think, as psychiatrists, to understand. You mentioned the biological, psychological, social. We understand the neurobiology, but I think it's a shared responsibility here. We can't do it all on our own. So the society and the cultural shift that you just described on what's acceptable and what's not, to the point of, threats and violence. I mean, that's the world we live in. But what are your, discussions around education when you're talking with coaches, athletic trainers, everybody else who's talking to these athletes day to day? Do they share that responsibility with us to create policy and open up safe places to have these conversations about gambling?
It's starting to. I think one of the things we've seen over the last 5 years is there's a group called Epic. They come in and do in-person trainings, and usually they'll bring a lived experience speaker, a former athlete that struggled with gambling, and share his or her journey with the team. That's a really powerful experience for a lot of athletes to hear about that. I've done that, a few of those shows, with athletes, and they always gravitate to the athlete and want to hear that, and that resonates. I think other coaches and trainers sometimes they're like, yeah, but I got so many other things to cover. I don't have time for this. I think in the college space, I see this a lot where coaches are like, I only have X number of hours a week for practice. I can't give up that time to teach about something else. I've had a couple of pro teams, say, no, we're worried about this and we want to get ahead of it. And they proactively do trainings, once or twice a year. Other teams are like, you know what? If they gamble, that's on their own. I can't control it. So it's a mixed bag. I'll give the NBA a lot of credit. I'm part of the Mind Health Network, and we spend time training each other therapists. We spend time training the rookies. We spend time constantly creating an office that responds to requests from the coaches, from the trainers, from GMs, and things like that. So all that's starting to happen. It takes a while, I think. But I think ultimately what we're going to get at, hopefully in the next 5 or 10 years, are again, standard set of tools and trainings that are occurring across all levels, and then best practices that teams and coaches can use to really kind of help, support their athletes and prevent things like that. Again, one of the things about player props, I think we forget when we see the gambling scandals in the news, everyone starts to come up with their own judgments and whatnot. But you also have to remember some, you know, athletes that get caught up in them that, you know, fall, quote, why would they do these things? There's that part of the training. So I was at a Major League Baseball training where they constantly hammered, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And then 2 years later, a couple players did. So does that mean the training didn't work, or did that mean they just need to continually retrain folks? And sometimes we forget that, for young athletes that know they're not going to make a gazillion dollars, there are all these forces that are so tempting. So for instance, baseball is a perfect example where if you're an athlete and someone approaches you who said, hey, I'll give you $50,000 to throw one ball in the dirt, and you are sure, why not? And you don't think that's a gambling problem. You don't think that's hurting anybody. You don't realize that you're interfering with the integrity of the game. You just think, oh, I'm doing somebody a favor. No big deal. So all that's part of the training for athletes to say that, no, you can't, you know, disturb the integrity of the game. Now, it's weird because a lot of athletes will say, yeah, but there's lots of times I take plays off or I take days off. Isn't that just disturbing the integrity of the game? Well, yes and no, but that's not based on a money issue. If you decide to take a play off because
Mhm.
you're just tired, that's not, voluntary because of money. And I think these are the discussions about integrity that are so fascinating.
Yeah, I wonder, for people who are listening, and just a quick thought, Mark, I don't know about you, but spring training, half the roster is new every year, I mean, and it's a lot of people to continually educate. So you brought up an important point about peer support and how powerful that is. Someone to come in and say, hey, I've had this problem. We've had people on the podcast like that who have had addictions. And I think that's really powerful for a young player to know that there's somebody out there they can go to. But if someone's listening right now, maybe they're an athlete, maybe they're a medical student, they're saying, I might have a problem with gambling, or my family member does. What's your first recommendation usually to them as far as getting an assessment or getting treatment?
Yeah, so it's no different than if they have some concerns about their substance use or they're depressed or their sleep, is to go get in front of a professional. And that's hard because too often people view gambling as a solution to their problems, not the problem itself. So usual route is, go get a evaluation by a mental health professional, either attached to the team, or in some cases, athletes don't want to see anyone officially with the team, of course, for complete privacy. So we say to any athlete, if you have any, the way I describe it, if you're curious about your gambling, not necessarily are you worried about it. If you're curious about what your gambling is doing to your body, your brain, your mind, go ahead and make an appointment with someone experienced in understanding gambling behavior. And then that gets the conversation started. Most of the time, the folks that come into our office, just non-athletes or whatnot, I'd say half of them are because their family member is so worried. And in this case, it's usually mom or dad, for those guys between 18 and 25. They see their son or daughter spending too much money. They see life problems. They know what's going on. They're worried. They call and say, hey, my son or daughter's got a problem. I want to bring him in. And the other half of the time, it's the person who's like, oh my gosh, I really need to get help. But by the time they call someone like myself, things are really, really severe. Harmful
Yeah.
consequences are really deep, 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 deep. Because people don't tend to call after they lost $500. They're calling
Hmm.
me when they've lost their job or they become suicidal or they're, unable to function at work, things are really, really, or they're criminal charges against them. So part of our message in that is to try and educate people much earlier and try and get people who are curious about gambling information. So, there's an app out there I work with called eVive, EVIVE, that gives people education about gambling, go walk through the signs of gambling addiction, walks through the odds, demystifies, what gambling is and isn't. There's 1-800-GAMBLER, which still exists as a national helpline for anyone to call 24/7 for acute crisis. And again, for athletes, what we usually do, like for instance, at UCLA, the start of the year, we'll get in front of each team and say, introduce ourselves. Hey, we're the mental health team. We're available here for you. My expertise is in the gambling side. If you're ever curious about the gambling, make an appointment, come talk to me, completely confidential. And a few athletes will do that on their own. But we also very much talk to trainers. The trainers, I think, are our key resource. When they see things, are concerned about it, then they're the ones oftentimes that call us and say, hey, I noticed so-and-so was gambling or so-and-so's performance is declining. We're just wondering, if there's something going on there. Can you do an assessment?
Yeah, just to normalize it a little bit further, you don't have to wait till you hit rock bottom to go in for treatment. I think you articulated that, or for an assessment. Just go in if you're curious. And Mark, I know we'll put in the meeting notes those resources that were just described at the end of the episode.
Absolutely. One more shout out to we have a lot of athletic trainers that actually listen to us because, they're the bartenders and the barbers of the world who hear everything and are definitely boots on the ground helping us with prevention. I think what you're talking about here is, you don't have to hit rock bottom to seek help because we're wanting to go from a reactive to a proactive approach, which is thinking of psychiatry not as the, oh shit button, but rather involve us at the beginning so we can help with a care plan that actually really works. Um, I said that let's talk about treatment because I think it would be really helpful for us out there to know what does effective therapy treatment look like for gambling disorder.
That's an awesome question. And oftentimes when people close their eyes, they can't envision it. It's not like I put you inside a machine and check you with anything or run a scan or take something out of your blood. So imagine biopsychosocial causes for addiction, biopsychosocial solutions. So under the biological treatments, we have certain medications like naltrexone and some other ones that can reduce urges or cravings for gambling. We use medications to treat the other co-occurring mental health conditions that might be driving the gambling, let's say ADHD or depression, and you treat those things and gambling problems also go down. But even things like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, is starting to emerge as a possible treatment for gambling disorder. But the other biological treatments, to me, are super simple: sleep, physical movement, and healthy nutrition. And for years, people would say, what are you talking about? We learned that in kindergarten. How could that be treatment? Well, many times when folks come in with gambling disorder, they're not sleeping well. Their bodies are in a state of fight or flight all the time. Adrenaline's running all the time. That's not good, right? That's not good for the body. And so by correcting what you eat, how you physically move in a way, less relevant for athletes, but a lot of other folks that come in never exercise at all, and correcting their sleep. Sleep is such a pivotal one for athletes, right? And, we get a lot of complaints from our Big Ten UCLA members for not sleeping well when they go on these trips to the Midwest and their performance suffers, right? So that's biological treatments. Psychological treatments are that individual psychotherapy and counseling that we do to really work on all those things: the guilt, the shame attached with gambling losses, understanding how to manage urges and cravings, understanding what your triggers are to gamble, reworking distorted views on gambling. As an example, some gamblers come in and say, "Oh, you know what? I can't lose on my birthday. So every birthday, I'm going to go and gamble heavily." Or, you know what? The Bears never beat the Packers in Lambeau. So, of course, I'm going to always bet the Packers, things like that. And you rework the distortions so that people realize that what their views on gambling aren't true. Another perfect example, I've had a number of gamblers who insist that they control the axis of the dice in craps games. And they're like, I have the skill. I can control, I can get any number to come up. And we talk about how distorted view that is, that that's a superpower that just legitimately does not exist. But that's kind of what we do in psychotherapy. Social treatments, Gamblers Anonymous, of course, the 12-step support group, very, very, very good. But also now I fold in, we have things like this, podcasts, just watching podcasts, or about a dozen podcasts I know about that are voices of gambling recovery. So that if you're in recovery, you listen to someone like you or someone completely different from you, but you hear how their journey worked, that's an incredibly powerful tool. But we also have specific to gambling software blockers. We have, again, I mentioned some of these apps. We have self-exclusion policies. So for brick and mortar casinos. So we have a whole array of tools to help people minimize the risks from ongoing gambling and to do activities. I think, but at the end of the day, it's very similar to what we do for other addictive disorders. It's really making a decision to live a life of recovery, a life comprised of wellness and self-care and citizenship and productivity and doing something that you envision doing. I notice a lot of folks, they don't want to give up the gambling because they're like, well, once I give that up, what else do I have that's exciting? Or the gambling was my only thing that made me feel normal, or I love that escape feeling. So we spend a lot of time in psychotherapy to demystify it and say that really, that's the only thing in this world that's going to get your dopamine going. And we really spend a lot of time. It takes the privacy and the relationship, I think, of psychotherapy to get there. Oftentimes people misunderstand and say, well, can't you just stop? And that's the whole thing with addiction. Can't you just stop and say no? Can't you just realize that this is bad for you and just not log on to the app? Well, the whole principle of addiction is that if people could do that, they wouldn't have that addiction. And I think that's, people still struggle with that because they think, oh, it's gambling. You're not intoxicated. Your power and willpower should be at maximum control all the time. And that's just not the case for folks with this disorder.
So you touched on a lot of things there. Restricting access, peer support, the role of psychoeducation and listening to podcasts, and similar things to hear stories that might really hit someone where they need to listen. I'm thinking about other particular populations like injured athletes. Their injury recovery groups sometimes can be hard to find, especially if a cohort forms. And then they may not actually now have a space. But the Injured Athletes Club podcast is a great thing to listen to while you might be waiting to do that. I guess my question for you is, at what point would maybe a higher level of care be useful? Is there any sort of like gambling detox protocol? I would love to hear kind of a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of that.
Yeah. So there's a whole steps of recovery and treatment. So the highest level, of course, is residential treatment program for gambling disorders. And there are a number of those in America. And that's going to be appropriate for men and women who need containment, who are, let's say, near suicidality or have a lot of co-occurring substance use disorder that are potentially very concerning from putting them at risk for overdose. Maybe they're embroiled in a legal problem and need containment. Maybe they just need to be a place where they don't have their phone and it's taken away for a few days. So that is the highest level of care. Of course, there's a lot of partial hospital programs and intensive outpatient programs out there as well. And of course, individual therapy can be done daily or weekly, of course, through telehealth. But I think it's no different than any other addictive disorder. Imagine someone with the highest concern, they're going for alcohol addiction. We want them monitored 24/7 by nursing. So there is, interesting, you said that detox, there is for some folks, a gambling withdrawal state where when they are not able to gamble, they'll get like a flu-like syndrome, can't sleep, can't eat, very distressed in their head, autonomically unstable. So shockingly, people are like, oh, what is that? And that is a physiologic, biological response to not having the activity that you're used to. Your body literally is in a state of withdrawal. It's not deadly or whatnot, but it's pretty annoying, and you could certainly suffer from that. All the message is that all the treatment options and availabilities that we have for substance use disorder, we do have for gambling disorder, and that there isn't one size fits all. And I've had some folks where they requested right away, I need to go to residential. I can't do this as outpatient and voluntarily if that's what they want to choose, and that works for them there as well. So, but there are a number of these places out there. And I think for athletes, it's tricky, right? Because I've had a couple athletes that were, quote, mandated to go to residential right away. And it turned out they didn't have a gambling disorder at all. And that was a complete waste of their time and resources. And so again, it always starts with a good, holistic, comprehensive assessment to determine what is the best treatment setting for that person or that athlete. And so that's super important because the last thing we'd want is to expose someone to excessive amounts of treatment than that's necessary, or worse, undertreat them and not treat them in a proper setting, and then things get worse.
Yeah, you guys are both hitting on some things that I've been thinking about, which is, identity, competitiveness of an athlete and of the athletic, population and that mind. And they want that competition. When they're taken away from it, whether it be by injury or let's say retirement, I don't know the answer to this, Tim. Do you see a lot of retired athletes or professionals who then get into gambling as a way to kind of fill that competitive drive? Plus, they're in a more of a they're taken away from their team or their teammates. They're a little bit more isolated, maybe more prone to developing the disorder and then the shame and guilt that comes along with it.
Oh,
I'm
absolutely.
thinking of also like, Michael Jordan who gets into like gambling with golf, and just needs that edge, that hit of dopamine, if you will. Sorry, go ahead,
Yeah.
Tim.
But that's the whole thing about athletes and gambling in general, the unique parts of their nature, the competitiveness, the surge for dopamine, the athletic fighting about all that stuff is part of it. And we do see that a lot in some retired athletes there as well. So I always say to those folks, listen, we want competition. You need dopamine, you need action, you need escape, you need things that drive you, you need passion, but you need it in a moderate amount, right? You can't be going for excessive or in areas. I'm working with a former Major League Baseball player right now. Perfect example. He's, I don't know, like 50, and he's got ADHD. He struggled with alcohol, and he keeps saying, "I'm so tempted to get in on the sports betting because it seems really cool." And he's like, "But I know if I do, I have a lot of potential to go develop a problem." So he's got that insight.
Mhm.
But he also says, and he says what a lot of retired folks say, I know this game so well. My knowledge will give me an edge in betting on the sport. And that's something to bring up with a lot of our athletes. Just because you're in it doesn't mean you have any insider info. So I had another guy years ago who's active pro tennis player. And he's like, "Oh, I played against these guys. I know these guys. I know when they're going to fold. I know when they're not going to play well. I can guarantee that." I said, "Based on what?" He said, "I just know these." So sometimes, again, for a lot of athletes, either in it or retired, there's some false sense of knowledge. There's a false sense of skill that I know what's going to happen when in fact we don't. Many of these things still are ultimately random and not up to conscious choice. But I think that's one of the key things I highlighted a lot of athletes who are injured or retired. We have to spend a lot of time finding out where are you going to get your passion again. Where are we going to find something? And not so much to warn them, say, don't ever gamble, but again, to educate about the risk that this is a rabbit hole. And if you have some of those potential risk factors, untreated mental health conditions, high level of impulsivity, high competition that can't be satisfied, false belief that you have a skill in gambling, those are the risk factors that we'd be worried about for anyone, let alone athletes, going into this area.
Tim, I read an article that you had been interviewed in for, and you made a really cool point about language and the power of language, and saying like, how we say we lost money gambling versus spending money on dinner or a movie. Can you tell me what that distinction means and why it matters so much?
Yeah, I was thinking about, because I think when we say the word I spend, there's a voluntary like choice. I spent $200 to go to a Laker game. I wanted to do that. It was fine. And even if the game didn't go my way, I feel like there was some value. Even if you had a bad meal, well, I didn't know it was going to be so bad, but I spent my money, so be it. It happens. Versus when you say I lost $200, there's almost an implied it was taken from me. It was almost stolen. It was someone robbed me. And there's kind of almost an emotional anger about that. And I hear that a lot with gamblers when they're like, oh, 10,000 or 5,000 this weekend. I'm like, well, no, you spent it. They're like, no, I lost it. I'm like, no, you spent it. What's the difference? And they're the ones that educated me to say, no, I got screwed. I lost it. Or I made a bad choice. I kept chasing my losses, which is a reflection on me. And ultimately they felt worse about themselves. From a financial budgeting standpoint, we say, how much do you want to spend on clothes, food, shelter, entertainment? We don't say, how much do you want to lose on clothes this year? Right? So, and again, the implication of lose, the opposite is win. And I think when you use that kind of language, win or lose, you're again equating, there's almost a morality there. Like you're truly a winner in life and you're a winner in the game. You're a good person. Whereas spend, there is no real kind of like, he's a reckless spender, right? There's always going to be an adverb attached to that. When you just say, oh, I spent X amount, people don't think of you as, oh my God, how could you do that? That was so silly. So it's just a little bit of a nut, but words do matter because it's how it affects how people feel about themselves. And that's just something that patients have taught me. So I really took that and said that really matters. And let's look at how we're phrasing it.
Yeah, and we think so black and white sometimes too. You win or you lose, and if you're losing money, that's a negative connotation. But I'm going to start using that language.
Love that. Another perfect example where investing versus gambling, and the activities are essentially the same now, but we still think of the word investing as kind of a good positive, it's a good thing. You're saving for the future, but there's still risk with all investments. So
That's a great comment. Mark, we should move into the rapid fire speed round, but maybe before we do, just, is there anything that gives you hope? Landscape, society, we hear a lot of bad news. What gives you hope about the sports landscape and what we're talking about with gambling?
well, there's a couple of things. I think about like whose lives are improved by gambling on sports. Who's enjoying life more because of sports gambling? Well, there's still millions of people that do this and really get a thrill out of it. They like it. Like the whole point of, I think, sports and gambling, it's supposed to bring people together, right? Enhance connections. And many of the leagues in the very beginning on the run up were okay with partnerships with the gambling operators because they said, well, we need to continue to engage the new fan. We're losing fans. We need people to continue to build the next generation. And they thought, for right or wrong, this is one way to do it. So attention on sports has never been higher. You just heard today about 19 million people watching, an NFL Week 18 games, massive numbers. So discussions about this intersection between money, gambling, sports, fandom, fanaticism, how we view ourselves, what these athletes are. Are they role models? Are they commodities? Are they influencers? All of these, I think, are very, very interesting. At the end of the day, I love sports. Sports is a huge part of my life. Without sports, there'd be a big hole to fill. But ultimately, I'd find other things to fill it, right? And I think what gives me hope is discussions like this and coming at it from different angles to say, what are we doing? What are we doing with these products that we are creating and allowing to be created? And I think the more we talk about it, the more we're going to see the public declare what they want or don't want. I mean, ultimately, these products only exist if people buy them or spend on them. Eventually, enough people say, I don't want to put a $20 bet on a guy to see if he makes 10 rebounds or not. That's not interesting to me. If the market goes down, then there is no market. The thing is, gambling's been around since the dawn of mankind, and we think that they're always coming up with new games, new wagers, new bets, that are new and fresh. So what gives me hope is that I see more and more attention paid to these questions and these topics than ever before. I see more and more institutions, colleges, universities, sports leagues, financial institutions, all curious about impact of sports betting and gambling. One of the really cool things we're doing on now at UCLA Gambling Studies Program is we're going into financial institutions like banks, credit unions, payday loan folks, and hearing their stories about gambling and educating them about when should a bank intervene when someone's withdrawing too much money for a gambling operator. Like in Europe, boom, banks shut you down. You start pulling money out and it's an online casino operator, they'll say, no, we're not going to allow this transaction to go through, after like $500 or whatever. So all that sort of thing. I think, again, the more more people, sports and gambling and what it does to their communities, the more we're going to get it. At the end of the day, what do we all want? We want, again, more entertainment. We want sports that we know are true and honest, and we just want the thrill. I think back to, like, Mark and I talked about it last time we got together, Game 7 of the World Series this year with Toronto and the Dodgers. And regardless of whether you're a baseball fan or not, tremendous storyline, tremendous theater, captivating experience. We watched the game here with our family, and for 4 hours, we were so connected, engaged, and just having the greatest time. That's kind of what we want, right? And regardless of whether gambling is part of that or not, I think those are the questions we have to see moving forward.
Yeah, that was a beautiful game. Mark, you want to take us in to have some fun with the speed round?
Yeah. Okay. So we didn't prep you on this one. Rapid fire, buddy. What sport do you love watching but would never want to play?
Oh, that would be football.
All
I
right.
don't want to get hit by a 300-pound lineman.
That's good. Mark, can I add another one?
Yeah.
What is your favorite sport to play?
Oh, tennis by far. I play tennis 6 or 7 days a week, no problem.
All right, we're playing next. What are you, USTA or UTR rating? What do you go by now?
Probably about a 4.25 USTA, yeah.
Hey, perfect. Yeah, I got a 4 or 5 team I'm playing with in 45 minutes from now. So I'm with you.
Probably a bunch of sandbaggers, though, right? Because we played in a 4-0 league in the summer, and these people were all like college former players, and all these people were sandbagging. But
Hey, at the 40 and over level, there's even more sandbagging. But anyway, Mark,
I
you're up.
am 1-0 in my USTA career as a self-rated 4-0. So just throwing that out there because I got to play with my wife who's very good and was mixed doubles and it was great. So next, if you could sit courtside or sidelines for any event in sports history, what would it be?
Oh, without a doubt, easy. WrestleMania 3. WrestleMania 3.
WrestleMania 3 was awesome.
Yeah. That's surprising.
If I had a time machine, that's the first place I'm going with at the time machine. I'm going into Pontiac Silverdome, 1987, I think it was. WrestleMania 3.
Okay, follow-up question to that. Who is your favorite historical figure in pro wrestling, and who is your favorite current talent member?
Oh, well, current, there's no doubt. I love CM Punk, and I think he's absolutely phenomenal. I have a Chicago Cubs CM Punk shirt. And then historical, it still has to be Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. I mean, he's not dead, but I mean, he was a huge influence on my life in high school and college. In fact, I wrote an essay about Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. I went to Northwestern, and at the time we were really struggling with Asian American studies and getting noticed. And I wrote this whole essay about Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, how he was a hero of mine, how he won the Intercontinental title, and then he lost it 30 days later to the Honky Tonk Man. And I thought this was such an affront to Asian American cause. He finally won the title, and boom, he lost it a month later. So I had that essay buried somewhere, so I'll have to bring that out at some point.
I cannot wait to read that.
Tim, you work with athletes. We know athletes have all these little idiosyncrasies or routines, superstitions. What is a habit or routine that you swear by that maybe other people might find odd?
So there's two. I mean, well, number one, I have a sauna in the house. So I have to use the sauna every single day.
I have one as well. I'm with you.
There you go. There you go. And that is a major routine for me to have that. 20 minutes a day, 160 degrees, little eucalyptus oil mixed in there. That keeps me centered.
I
I
haven't
love
gotten
it.
in on the sauna game. I got to add that. I got a steam shower, but it's not the same. All right, next. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received that wasn't work related?
It's probably from my dad. He had two. One was play to win, but we're not going to go with that one. But he said, if someone opens your door for you, you stick your foot in it. And for years, I didn't quite grasp what he meant by that. But I think he's basically saying if someone is giving you an opening or opportunity, advocate for yourself to say, hey, I'm here, I'm ready, I want to be part of what you're doing.
That's
I love
beautiful.
that. Love
Yeah.
that.
You know, I think we might know the answer to this based on your WrestleMania answer, but if you were not if you were not doing what you do now as a sports psychiatrist and, an expert in your field, what would your alternate career be?
Well, it was interesting. In college, I was actually an English and bio major, and I was heavily influenced by the writings of Michael Crichton. At the time, ER first came out,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, wouldn't that be amazing to be like a science fiction writer or a medical novel writer? And then I toyed with that for maybe about a week when I realized how hard it is to write a novel and everything. But in an alternate reality, that would be, I think, super amazing to create stories like that and share with the world.
Oh, I didn't know. I figured you were going to say I wanted to be a script writer for WWE, but
No, it's real. What are you talking about?
oh, did I say it out loud? Okay. Finally, do you think there will ever be nationally legalized sports betting?
Absolutely not. I mean, this is America, and we don't like to do anything on a national level. I mean, many, many countries in Europe and in Australia and in Asia, they run gambling operations from the national level, and it's a lot better. You just have a couple apps, you have a couple, you have a single policy for the whole country. We don't have that. We don't have a national policy for tobacco or for alcohol or cannabis. And even broadcasting, we kind of do, but we don't really. So I don't see that happening. I'm not even sure what federal government would do it. So it is tricky because we've now created every state has their own rules and regulations. So I think what we could see are some national guidelines on taxation or finances or what are best practices. And I'll give you an example. One of the bills that were put forth last year in Congress is the whole idea of taxing, like gamblers, poker players, more, based on not on how much you lost, but on how much you actually bet. So in other words, if I played poker and I got up to $200,000, but then I left the table at 100,000, I'm actually taxed $200,000, not 100,000. It's
Wow.
incredibly unfair, right?
Yeah.
So that's a national policy. So I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon, but it would be tremendous if we got some guidance from a national and resources. One of the biggest concerns we have in our field of gambling is that we don't have a lot of federal funding for research into gambling behaviors or treatment. So I think those are the things that can happen much faster than any sort of national agency running casinos.
Well, Tim, Dr. Fong, thank you so much for joining us today, for your leadership, your clarity, and the work that you're doing at the intersection of psychiatry, public health, and sport. This is really valuable.
And thank you for having me. This is great. Anytime.
Yeah, this was awesome, Tim. This is probably one of my favorite episodes that we've had, one of my favorite conversations we've had. Just for the listeners, we're going to include all those resources we talked about in the show notes. And if this conversation resonated with you, we encourage you to reach out for support for someone you care about or for yourself. And if this conversation, if you enjoyed it, please subscribe and like and all those things as well. But, let's do this again soon.